A serviceable aircraft, a seasoned captain with 11,000 hours in the air, weather good enough to land, and still, just a few minutes before touchdown, the flight vanishes from radar without a single distress call. On the 24th of July, 2025, an An-24 operated by Angara Airlines was on approach to Tynda along the route of the Baikal-Amur Mainline. 48 people were on board, 5 of them children. The aircraft struck a hill some 15 kilometers short of the runway. How could this happen if the machinery never failed? The answer turned out to be stranger than any breakdown. The whole time, the pilots were flying 500 meters lower than their instruments showed them. This is a story about a chain of small things, and any single one of them would have been enough to keep everyone alive. The morning of the 24th of July, 2025, over the taiga of the Amur region, near the city of Tynda on the Baikal-Amur Mainline, flight India Kilo 2311 is on approach. The aircraft is flying the final leg of a long journey, Khabarovsk, then Blagoveshchensk, and now Tynda. It is an An-24 RV of Angara Airlines from Irkutsk, an ordinary regional aircraft, the kind you can count by the dozen in the Russian Far East. 48 people are on board, 42 passengers and 6 crew members. Among the passengers are 5 children, the youngest only a few months old. The weather at the airport at that moment is perfectly flyable. Visibility more than 10 kilometers, light rain, broken cloud over the hills. Nothing foretells disaster. The crew is in contact with the ground, flying the approach by the chart, reporting their actions to the controller. The captain had done this work thousands of times. And then, over the radio, something happens that should not happen. The crew reports that they are going around. This is a routine procedure when an approach cannot be completed to landing on the first attempt. The aircraft begins a second approach, and at that point, the radio exchange breaks off. The controller waits for a report at the assigned checkpoint, and the report never comes. He calls the aircraft again and again. Silence. The blip disappears from the screen. In calm weather, just minutes from the runway, with an experienced captain at the controls, and not a single word that anything was going wrong. A break in communication, an emptiness where a landing should have been. The search would take hours, and the central question that investigators of the Interstate Aviation Committee would later have to unravel sounds almost incredible. How did a routine approach in flyable weather end in total silence? Let us begin with the aircraft that did not survive it. Registration Romeo Alpha 47315. This An-24 RV rolled off the line on the 29th of January 1976. By July of 2025, the machine was nearly 49 years old. Over that time, it had passed through 7 operators, flying under the wing of different companies in different countries and regions, until it ended up in the Angara fleet. The An-24 itself is a legend of Soviet regional aviation. A turboprop short-haul airliner, designed in the early 60s, it was built in the hundreds. Rugged, able to land on short and unpaved strips, for decades it carried people to places larger airliners could never reach. In the Far East, in Siberia, along the Baikal-Amur Mainline, machines like these are often the only air link to remote towns. For Tynda, a flight on an An-24 is not a luxury, but a way to reach the wider world. But the legend has its other side. Age. Production of the An-24 in the Soviet Union ended back in the 70s. Almost no new aircraft of this class are built in Russia, and a full replacement for the type never appeared. The fleet is aging, the aircraft fly for 40 years and more, and every year troubling questions are raised about their service life and safety. The Tynda crash sharpened those questions instantly. People saw the figure 49 years and drew what seemed an obvious conclusion. The aircraft fell apart from old age, and the investigation would not confirm that conclusion. When the specialists pieced together the circumstances of the flight, it turned out that the machine had obeyed its commands and held together right up to the impact with the ground. Technically, it was sound, which means something else had steered the aircraft off a safe path. In the cockpit of Romeo Alpha 47315 sat men for whom this type of aircraft was familiar down to the smallest detail. The captain, Vyacheslav Logvinov, 61 years old. His total flight time was around 11,200 hours, and thousands of those were on the An-24 itself and the related An-26. He was a deeply experienced pilot of the old school, a man who had spent decades in the air. Beside him, the first officer, Kirill Plaksin, 37 years old, with more than 1,900 hours on the type. The third member of the flight crew was the flight engineer, Vladimir Vokmintsev. In the cabin worked flight attendant Anastasia Besmertnaya, and on board were also two engineering and technical support specialists, Vitaly Koltanov and Alexei Lysenko. This crew had experience, but experience does not cancel out the peculiarities of the airfield they were heading for, and Tynda is no easy airport. The city stands on high ground. The runway itself lies at an elevation of more than 500 meters above sea level. Around it is not a plain, but hills, wooded slopes that rise toward the sky on almost every side. This terrain does not forgive errors in altitude. Where over a seacoast an aircraft would have a margin, over Tynda there is already ground beneath it. Add to that the airport's equipment. There is no precision approach system of the ILS class at Tynda, the kind that guides the aircraft along a beam all the way to the runway, both in heading and in glide angle. The approach is flown on instruments, by a pre-calculated chart, where the crew themselves maintain the altitudes at every step. Everything rests on one thing, that the readings of the instruments in the cockpit are correct. The slightest systematic error in counting altitude here leaves almost no room for correction, and just such an error was already lying in wait for the crew, set in place, as it would turn out, before takeoff. To understand what exactly went wrong, we need to grasp one technical subtlety. It sounds dry, but within it lies the key to the entire tragedy. It concerns how an aircraft measures altitude. The main instrument here is the barometric altimeter. It determines altitude by air pressure. The higher you climb, the lower the pressure. But every barometer has a problem. Atmospheric pressure is always changing, with the weather, with the spot on the ground, with the time of day. So before the approach to landing, the crew must set the correct reference pressure on the altimeter. And here the fork in the road begins. There are two reference systems. The first is called QFE. With it, the pressure right at the airfield is set on the altimeter, and the instrument shows height above the runway. At the ground it reads 0. The second system is QNH. With it, the pressure reduced to sea level is set, and the altimeter shows altitude above sea level. On the ground at an airfield that is itself raised above the sea, it reads not 0, but the elevation of that airfield. For decades, Soviet and later Russian aviation worked with QFE, height above the runway, familiar and intuitive to pilots of the old school. The rest of the world mostly flies by QNH, and Russia was gradually converting its airports to this international standard. The difference between the two systems is exactly the elevation of the airfield above the sea. For a lowland field that is a few dozen meters, but for Tynda, raised above 500 meters, it is half a kilometer. To confuse QFE and QNH here means to be wrong about altitude by 500 meters. And the whole question now is which of the two systems the crew was actually prepared for on the day of departure. The root of the disaster lies even earlier, on the ground, at the stage of preparing for the flight. According to the findings of the Interstate Aviation Committee, the crew was not ready for an approach to an airfield that had been converted to operating on QNH pressure. The procedure the pilots were used to, setting the airfield pressure and reading height above the runway, no longer worked here the way they expected. And it was in setting the pressure for Tynda that the fatal confusion occurred. The QNH and QFE values became mixed up. The pilots read the altimeter as though the instrument were measuring height above the runway, but the instrument, set to sea level pressure, was counting altitude above the sea, that is, exactly the elevation of the Tynda airfield higher. The consequence was simple and inescapable. When the crew saw a safe figure on the altimeter and believed there was a solid margin beneath the wing, the aircraft was in fact about 500 meters lower. Every time the pilots thought they were holding the altitude prescribed by the chart, the machine was creeping toward the ground far more dangerously than the needles showed. The hardest thing in this story is that the error was not instantaneous, not a flash in a critical second. It had ripened in advance, quietly, back during the pre-flight preparation, when nothing prevented it from being noticed. A deeply experienced captain, a competent first officer, and yet the wrong point of reference lay at the foundation of the entire approach. From that moment on, the aircraft was doomed to fly on a false altitude, unless someone, in the cockpit or on the ground, caught the discrepancy. For just such a case, aviation has an entire system of cross-checks. The only question was whether even one of them would work. The first to work should have been the radio exchange with the ground. On approach to landing, the controller passes the crew the current pressure so the pilots can set it on the altimeter. The procedure is routine, but vitally important. It is here that the crew receives confirmation from the ground of the pressure on which they are now flying. According to the investigation materials, the controller passed the crew a QNH pressure value, but he passed it in millimeters of mercury, in the units familiar to Russian aviation and to the QFE system. Moreover, according to the IAC findings, the pressure was given without a request from the crew and without a clear, unambiguous indication that this was the sea-level reduced pressure of the new system. From the outside, this seems a trifle, a number on the air, a unit of measurement. But in aviation, it is from precisely such trifles that disasters are made. Hearing the familiar millimeters of mercury, the crew could unwittingly fit that number into their old, accustomed picture, as though it were the airfield pressure and the altitude were read above the runway. The confusion seeded during preparation received over the air not a correction, but something like a silent confirmation. And here, the rule that could have saved everything failed to work. The pilots did not cross-check the transmitted pressure against the approach altitudes assigned to them. That very cross-check is the safeguard. If the pressure and the altitudes do not match, the contradiction jumps out, and it becomes impossible not to notice. Anyone could have caught the discrepancy: the captain, the first officer, the controller. But step by step, the checks failed to trigger. So a small inaccuracy on the air settled on top of an error already made, and instead of breaking it, it reinforced it. The radio exchange, which should have cleared everything up, only cemented the false belief. The only question that remained was whether the crew had any other clues that the ground was far closer than it seemed. From the cockpit, let us descend to the ground, to the control point at Tynda. In a normal situation, the crew with their instruments are not the only ones watching the aircraft's altitude. The controller has a tool of his own, secondary surveillance radar. It receives data from the aircraft's transponder and shows on the screen not only the aircraft's position, but also its altitude. If the machine is flying dangerously low, the controller sees the figure and can warn the crew. This is one more independent safeguard, separate from what is happening in the cockpit. But that day at Tynda Airport, the secondary surveillance radar was out of order. It was not working, which means the controller, however attentively he followed the flight, could not monitor the aircraft's real altitude by instruments. On his screen, there was no figure that would have revealed the error. He did not see, and could not see, that the aircraft was creeping toward the hills far below a safe path. So another line of defense fell away, the view from the ground. In a sound flight safety system, there are deliberately several such lines, and they are built independently of one another. If the crew makes a mistake, the controller backs them up. If the equipment fails, the human remains. For a disaster to happen, several failures must coincide at once. That is exactly what was happening here, link by link. By this moment, the ground had already lost the aircraft from view, in the literal sense. The crew were left alone with their instruments, the very ones showing a false, inflated altitude. No one outside the cockpit saw the true picture. And yet inside the cockpit, one last line remained. A system created precisely to shout to the pilots about the nearness of the ground when nothing else can help. It is called the Terrain Awareness and Warning System, the system that gives early warning of rising ground. It is installed on the An-24 and is intended for exactly the kind of situation that was developing over Tynda. The system tracks how the aircraft is flying relative to the terrain, and if it draws dangerously close to the ground, it loudly warns the crew, by voice and by signal. It is not advice or a hint. It is a cry that should force the pilots to climb immediately. In many disasters, it is precisely such a system that has saved lives. When a crew, as here, sincerely believes there is a margin of altitude beneath the wing, while in reality a slope is rising beneath them, the voice of the system becomes the only thing telling the truth. It depends neither on the pressure that has been set, nor on what the pilots think, nor on the radar on the ground. It measures how fast the aircraft is actually closing on the ground. And here is the key finding of the investigation. The crew had switched off the aural warning of this system. The voice of alarm, designed for exactly this case, was turned off. Over complex terrain, among the hills, on an approach at a false altitude, The warning that could have turned the outcome around simply never sounded. That decision closed the chain. The error with the pressure set up the false altitude. The radio exchange did not catch it. The non-working radar deprived the controller of any way to see the danger from the ground. And the disabled warning removed the last independent safeguard in the cockpit itself. Each line fell for its own reason, but they all fell at once. Nothing more warned the people in the cockpit that the ground was right there. The instruments showed a calm, safe altitude. The system capable of crying out the truth was silent. And the aircraft was rolling into its second approach, into the place where the slopes of the hills rose ever closer to a flight path the crew could not see. The final minutes of the flight. The aircraft flies an approach to the runway on a heading of 06. The weather at the airfield is generally flyable, but near the hills, visibility is changeable, and in the approach zone, it is limited. The crew does not complete the first approach to landing. This is normal. If the pilots are not sure the approach has been flown correctly, and the runway is before them, the only right decision is to go around. The go-around is one of the most practiced procedures in aviation. The crew adds power to the engines, stops the descent, climbs, and approaches again. There is nothing exceptional in this maneuver. It is rehearsed hundreds of times. In itself, it is a sign of caution, not of trouble. But it is precisely on the second approach that the disaster occurs. The go-around becomes the last thing the crew manages to pass to the ground. After it comes a break in communication and silence at the point where the controller was waiting for confirmation. Here, everything converges. The machine, with a false altitude on its instruments, enters the area of the hills. The pilots are convinced there is a safe margin beneath them, that they are holding to the prescribed approach profile. What, in their picture of the world, was clear air beneath the wing, was in reality a wooded slope rising up to meet them. No one in the cockpit knows how close the ground is beneath them. The radar on the ground is blind. The warning system is silent. The experienced captain flies the approach the way he has done all his life, trusting the instruments. And the instruments, set to the wrong pressure, lead him straight toward a hill. The conclusion comes without warning and without a struggle. The aircraft had long been flying below the safe approach altitude, and at some point ahead on its course, there was no longer air, but ground. According to the investigation, before the crash, there was no fault signal, no attempt at an emergency maneuver, no report of danger. To the last second, no one in the cockpit understood what was happening. The machine clipped the crowns of the trees on the slope of the hill and struck the ground. The crash site was a wooded slope roughly 15 to 16 kilometers from Tynda Airport, amid that same high ground that surrounds the city. The aircraft, on its way to landing, slammed into a slope above which, by its instruments, it still had a margin of altitude. All 48 people on board died. There were no survivors, neither among the passengers nor in the crew. Among them were 5 children and people flying home, to visit, on a business trip, to their loved ones. In an instant, an ordinary regional flight came to an end, the kind that is flown by the hundreds in these parts. The aircraft dropped out of contact, and for a time, the ground still did not know what had happened. Search teams were raised on alarm. The wreckage on the slope of the hill was found only several hours later, too far from the runway, too high on the slope for an ordinary approach. The very fact of where the machine was found spoke for itself. It was somewhere it was never meant to be. When it became clear there were no survivors, the question for the investigation came to the fore. What had led an experienced crew in a sound machine to that slope, in flyable weather, just minutes from the runway? The answer had to be sought in the wreckage, and in the flight recorders that survived the impact and the fire. On the hill, the painstaking work begins. Search teams, investigators, and specialists make their way to the crash site. They gather the wreckage, document how the aircraft came to rest, and look for the thing that makes all this heavy labor worthwhile: the flight recorders. The so-called black boxes, which are in fact painted a bright color, hold the last data about the flight, and can tell what no one among the people can tell anymore. The An-24 has 2 such devices. One records the flight parameters, altitude, speed, the operation of the systems. The second captures the sound in the cockpit, the crew's conversations, the radio exchange, the signals. After the Tynda crash, the fate of the 2 recorders turned out differently. The flight data recorder was damaged in the post-crash fire. Its magnetic tape was destroyed by the flames. That is a serious loss, for it is usually by this recorder that the exact picture of altitude and speed is reconstructed. The cockpit voice recorder, however, was saved. Its transcript became the key to the entire investigation. What the specialists heard turned out to matter more than what had burned. The cockpit recordings contained no mention of any system failures, no alarm about malfunctions, no sign that the crew had suffered an equipment failure. The engines, the controls, the avionics, none of these failed before the impact. This finding turned the whole investigation around. Since there were no conversations about breakdowns in the cockpit, since the aircraft obeyed its commands to the last, the cause could not be pinned on old machinery or on a sudden failure. The machine was led to the slope, not by a malfunction, but by the actions of people, and a breakdown in the system of procedures itself, in how the pressure was set, how the radio exchange went, how the ground-based equipment worked, and what had been switched off in the cockpit. The sound of the cockpit and the circumstances of the approach formed a single chain of fatal decisions, and it remained to be reconstructed link by link. While the specialists worked through the recordings, public opinion had already passed its verdict. Right after the crash, attention was fixed on a single figure, the age of the aircraft. Almost half a century, 49 years for a machine that was carrying people. The theory of worn-out, end-of-life machinery sounded loud and seemed the most obvious. The old aircraft fell apart in the air, and there was the result. The theory landed on ready ground. The aging of Russia's An-24 fleet had long been discussed, and the crash looked like a terrible confirmation of those fears. But the investigation followed not the loud headlines but the facts, and the facts did not confirm it. The analysis showed the opposite. The engines were running, the systems were functioning, the structure was holding. The aircraft remained controllable and sound. There was no in-flight breakup, no failure that would have thrown the machine off its path. The aircraft's age turned out to be the loud backdrop of the tragedy, but not its mechanism. The convenient and easy-to-grasp mechanical theory fell away. And then the investigation shifted to where the real answer was hidden, to altitude, pressure, the approach to landing. The picture began to take shape differently. The aircraft had been flying the chart lower the whole time than the crew believed. It was not the engine that failed, not the wing. What failed was the point of reference by which the pilots were flying the machine. The altitude on the instruments had been false from the very start. So the story made its main turn. From the image of an old aircraft crumbling in the sky, the investigation arrived at a far more disturbing truth. A sound machine with an experienced crew had been driven to disaster by a chain of human errors and systemic failures. That chain remained to be recorded officially, precisely, point by point, without emotion. This was done by the Interstate Aviation Committee. Work on the final document was completed on the 29th of January, 2026, and it was published in early February. In it, the entire chain that has unfolded before us, link by link, is gathered and laid out. The main cause of the crash was named as the descent of the aircraft below the safe altitude during the approach to landing in difficult weather conditions near Tynda. But behind that formulation lies not a single error, but a combination of factors. And each of them on its own, perhaps, would not have led to disaster. The first link, the crew's lack of readiness for flights to airfields converted to QNH pressure, and the errors this caused in the use of QNH and QFE values for Tynda Airport. The second, that the controller passed the QNH pressure value without a request from the crew and in millimeters of mercury, that is, in the form familiar to the old system. The third, that the crew did not check the agreement of the set pressure with the assigned altitudes. The fourth, the absence of any instrumental altitude monitoring by the controller because of the non-working secondary surveillance radar at Tynda Airport. And the fifth, that the crew had switched off the aural warning of the terrain awareness and warning system. This is the classic picture that, in aviation safety, is called the Swiss cheese model. Each line of defense is like a slice of cheese with holes. On their own, the holes are not dangerous. The next slice covers them. A disaster happens only when the holes of all the slices happen to line up into a single channel running straight through. At Tynda, that is exactly what happened. The confusion over pressure, the imprecise radio exchange, the blind radar, and the disabled warning all coincided in one line. And the bitterest thing here is that the chain could have been broken at almost any link. One cross-check of pressure against altitudes, one working radar, one voice of alarm left switched on, Any one of them would have been enough for 48 people to land safely. Behind the dry lines of the report are living people who that morning were simply flying home. 5 of them children, including the very small, infants in their mother's arms. Whole families were flying, young parents with their daughter, a grandmother hurrying to collect her granddaughter for the holidays. Among the passengers was a surgeon with nearly half a century of experience. There were teachers, there were railway workers traveling on Baikal-Amur Mainline business. Ordinary people, for whom this flight was simply the road home or to their loved ones. In the Amur region and Khabarovsk territory, days of mourning were declared. The consequences for the airline came quickly. Rosaviatsia stripped Angara of its certificates in stages. As early as late July, its maintenance certificate was revoked, then its training center certificate, and by November of 2025, the airline had also lost its operator's certificate, that is, the right to carry passengers. The routes it had served with the An-24 and An-26 were handed over to other carriers in the Far East. But beyond a single company, the tragedy touched on far broader questions. It again laid bare the problem of the aging An-24 fleet, machines for which, in Russia's remote regions, there is still no replacement. And it showed how dangerous the very transition from the familiar QFE to the international QNH can be. Changing the reference point for altitude requires that every crew, every controller, and every airfield be truly ready for it. At Tynda, that readiness broke down. The main lesson of the disaster is simple and hard. The aircraft was sound, the crew was experienced, the weather allowed a landing, and yet several small things came together. A wrong pressure figure, a unit of measurement, a non-working radar, a disabled signal, each of which on its own seemed insignificant. In aviation, there are no insignificant small things. And for those who still fly over the taiga and the hills of the Baikal-Amur Mainline, this story leaves a hard reminder. Safety rests not on one line of defense, but on every one, and all of them must be guarded.